Hey, what's up, you guys? My name is Mitko Karshovski, and welcome to episode 95 of That Remote Life podcast, where we hear from location independent entrepreneurs and professionals so you can learn to quit the cubicle and live life on your terms. Today on the podcast, I'm very excited to be joined by Vikram Bharati, the founder of the Draper Startup House, previously called Tribe Theory. The Draper Startup House is the first hostel chain in the world designed specifically for entrepreneurs and digital nomad, and hopes to help create 1 million entrepreneurs by the year 2030. During this interview, Vikram and I discuss why he decided to start Tribe Theory after traveling the world for 2 years as a backpacker, how they've been able to grow into a global brand with locations in Asia, America, and Europe, and why creating more global entrepreneurs is such an important goal to them. We also get to discuss the general state of the digital nomad movement, why entrepreneurial skills are going to be so important in the future, and why they should be taught in school. And we also talked about some of the opportunities that Vikram sees in a post-COVID remote work focused world. Now, before we jump into the episode, I'd love to hear what you think about this podcast. I've made it very easy to leave a review. All you got to do is just head over to ratethispodcast.com/TRL and write your review. That's it. It's that easy. If you are enjoying this podcast, leaving a review is one of the best ways to support us. Reviews are a key statistic that Apple looks at in order to determine how to rank a podcast. So your review will directly help us climb the rank boards and attract new listeners. So thank you in advance for leaving a review if you choose to do so. If you want to check out the full show notes and a list of resources mentioned on this episode, you can do so over at thatremotelife.com/episode 95. That's episode all spelled out, followed by the number 95. All right, you guys, without further ado, let's dive into this interview with Vikram Bharati from the Draper Startup House. All right, Vikram, welcome to the show, man. I'm super excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited too.
Yeah, man. Well, so I was kind of doing research for this interview and kind of trying to figure out how to start this out. And I got to say, you have a pretty impressive background. You have an MBA from USC. You've worked as a banker for JP Morgan. And then you went on and kind of got involved into the venture capital world. So obviously, as the kid of immigrants, you have like every immigrant parent's child's like perfect kind of background and you know what you went on to do. But then you dropped all of that and you went backpacking for 2 years. So what happened, man? Like what made you take that shift?
Well, backpacking is something I've always wanted to do. And I just never got the chance to do it growing up. And so when the stars aligned and I had ticked the boxes, as you mentioned, I just felt it was the right time to go pursue something that I've always wanted to do. And initially, I wanted to just go for 6 months. But then after 6 months, I didn't want to stop. So it ended up being 2 years of me essentially just hopping around the world. And it was the best 2 years of my life. It was an itch I had, and I just had to do it.
So did you not travel at all when you were a kid and you just kind of like saved up all that wanderlust?
No, I traveled a little bit, but not as much as I wanted to, and not freely. You go on vacations, you go on these things, and it's not the same. I wanted to just be free, not have an agenda, not have a timeline, and just go with the flow. So I actually would only buy one-way tickets into countries, and I didn't have a return ticket. So I bought a one-way ticket to Argentina, and that was my first country that I went to. And I just literally would just go with the flow. I'd meet people, they'd say, hey, come to this country. Then I'd just take the train or hitchhike over to that country. And that's how 2 years went by. I had no plans at all.
And how were you? I think like when I was younger, I would have loved to, and I would still love to do that now. But I remember hearing stories of people doing what you did and going like, how in the hell did you fund this? Like, how did you have money saved up, or were you picking up like side jobs? What did you do to kind of keep yourself on the road and, have money in your pocket?
So three things. One, I had some money saved up, so that helped. Secondly, I was on a very low budget, so I kept things super, super, super low budget. And thirdly, I was doing side gigs while I was traveling. So I was trading, and I was doing just stuff on the computer, doing some consulting work. So I was working a little bit. I had some money saved up, and I kept it super low budget, and I was traveling solo. So I didn't have expectations of a partner to meet. So I kept it super low budget, and that's the reason why I didn't want to stop, because I was just having so much fun. And I could just sort of dictate my own agenda as I was traveling. So, and you'd be surprised how low budget you can travel on.
Yeah, I have a friend, Mitch, who actually he did this whole big post on how I think it was, I might be messing up the numbers here, but he wrote this blog post about how I'm going to pay off $20,000 of student loan debt by traveling. And it kind of like picked up because everybody was like, what? Like, isn't traveling expensive? But I think for people who don't travel often or think of traveling as like the only way to travel is to get $200 a night hotel rooms, a lot of those people don't actually realize that you can make traveling pretty inexpensive. And in many ways, like, I mean, I started traveling because I was kind of more looking for geo arbitrage. Like, I got involved in entrepreneurship, and I was like, well, I can either be living in the US where it's really expensive, or I can go to Eastern Europe where it's really cheap and there's nothing stopping me. So there's definitely cost benefits to doing that. How were you, or were you aware of the digital nomad movement at the time? Because essentially that's what you were doing. You were traveling and working online. So did you know about that at the time, and you kind of knew that was something that you could do, or did you find that out about that later?
Oh no, I had never heard the term digital nomad. I actually had never heard the term backpacker, like
Really?
as a lifestyle. I mean, I knew, like, I wanted to backpack for sure, but I didn't know that backpacking was such a huge cultural, you know, thing
Movement.
that
Yeah.
millions of people do. And so for me, I just wanted to pick up a bag and travel, and that's what I just was calling backpacking. But then as I was backpacking, I got introduced to new lifestyles like digital nomadism, backpacking. So I sort of fell into it. I just wanted to travel solo, and that's all I wanted to do. So this is 2014, and at that time, I'd spent 8 years in corporate banking, and so I was very far away from the lifestyles of a digital nomad. I had no idea. But as I was backpacking and traveling, I would meet these folks. And that's how I sort of fell into it and got introduced to a whole different lifestyle and a whole new set of cultures, which I think is super exciting.
Yeah, I totally share that with you. To me, there is something about like, it's not necessarily traveling that for me is really like, I love travel, but I do think there's a diminishing return of travel. Like, the 10th place isn't really as exciting or as enriching as the first place, right? And the 20th isn't quite as educational and as interesting as the 10th place, right? Like, it's sort of, you really, in order to have the same excitement and learning opportunity of traveling to one new very different place, you need to go to like 60 or something like that. But for me, the people who have figured out how to travel and work and are doing really cool things, they tend to be really, really cool people, right? Like, they tend to be very interesting, a lot of times working a lot of cool things. And like, I remember I met this guy in Bulgaria, in Varna, Bulgaria, where I hang out a lot, uh, who builds items inside of a video game. I don't know whether that's through coding or like actually his character in the video game is, I'm not sure like exactly how it works, but he sells it to other characters in the video game for like real money. And he's like, yeah, I'm doing like a couple $1,000s a month. And I was like, whoa, what? That's insane. That's so cool.
Yeah,
Um,
I do agree with you that there's definitely a diminishing return. I was done after 2 years. 2 years of traveling at one point. Actually, I was done a year and a half into it, but I wanted to visit a bunch of more countries. So I kept pushing myself to go. But you're right, after you see, X amount of city squares in Europe, then you're sort of like, okay, every other museum looks the same, every other city square looks the same. So after 2 years, I was done traveling. So I do agree with you, but it's because I kept my travel so low budget and started staying in these backpacker hostels. It really introduced me to a whole new world, which I think is fascinating. And because I kind of fell into it, I think I was able to see it from the outside and have some insights and observations and perspective about that lifestyle, which maybe someone who is in it may not be able to see. And that's sort of what's led me to get on my current journey in terms of
Mhm.
trying to build a business.
Do you feel like the time that you spent traveling has now made you a better entrepreneur in some ways?
Oh, definitely. There's, I think, 3 or 4 qualities or traits that I picked up while I was traveling, which definitely helps me with what I'm doing currently. And one of them was definitely being able to deal with uncertainties. Because when you're traveling solo, you don't really have an agenda. Things happen that you just haven't planned for, and you just kind of have to go with it. And so that quality of being comfortable with uncertainties of anything that can happen on the road is definitely something that I can apply to just life in general, but also in business. And then also the idea of being able to deal with people from all around the world. Like one of the general theses that I picked up while I was traveling was everyone is nice. Like people are nice. I never really came across any terrible situations anywhere I went, whether it's Morocco, whether it's, Peru or Tokyo. People are generally really, really nice. And I think when you don't travel, you have the stigma that the world is a terrible place because you see all these headlines in the media. It's completely bombarded in your face of all the things that are going wrong in the world. But you go to little towns and villages around the world and you say people are just people, all they all want the same thing. People just want to be happy, and people are nice. So in business, then you realize that generally you can trust should come first. Like you should give trust first, because generally people want to be nice and do the right things.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, you know, travel for me is like, and it's so, you're totally right, is that it makes you far more aware of the world than I think there's like, I have friends who have, for example, I think this is far more common in the United States than it is in most countries, but they've never like left like the state or haven't really traveled abroad. And that first time traveling, they like really realize like, oh, like my little corner of the world isn't what the rest of the world is like, but at the same time the people who live there still have the same desires and they still want the best for their kids and the best for their families, and so on and so forth. So, after you traveled and you said that you were kind of like done traveling after a year and a half, but you kept going, at what point during that traveling did you decide to start Tribe Theory and what is now the Draper Startup House, but at the time it's called Tribe Theory? At what point during your travels did that idea and that concept kind of come up for you, and why do that in the first place?
Yeah. So the idea to build this, I guess it was percolating in my head as I was traveling, but it didn't really manifest in terms of a desire to build this concept until I moved to Singapore towards the end of my travels. But while I was traveling, I had some observations, and particularly I had three sort of key observations. And this is all these observations are about the backpacking culture and the backpacking hostel spaces that I was staying in. And by the way, I'm older now, so the backpacking hostel, staying in, a 20 dorm room for $5 a night is probably not something that I do anymore. But when I did do it, those spaces, those backpacker hostel, legit backpacking hostel spaces, that's where I was staying. And I had three observations. The first one was, these spaces, tiny spaces, are such great aggregators of people. I'd be staying in a backpacker hostel in say, somewhere in the Ukraine, and I'd be having beers with people from 30 countries, right? Like, people from all around the world are there at night drinking cheap beers, and you're having these awesome conversations. So great aggregators of people from all around the world. And in fact, I actually haven't come across any physical spaces anywhere in the world where you can, in such a small space, get people from all around the world to come and hang out. So that's great aggregators of spaces, of people. Secondly, great distribution points. Like, if you are sitting there and telling a story, it sort of travels the world because everyone's sort of connected around the world. So great distribution points. The third insight was that all of the people that I was hanging out with, they're very interesting people. They're young. I call them seekers now, because they're all sort of, they were like me. They're seeking for new things, new experiences. They're open-minded. They want to learn new cultures. They want to experience new things. So they're open-minded. They're seeking for new things. They're generally young. So very interesting groups of people. So all of that led me to the insight, which was, all of these spaces have all these great qualities, but all of these spaces are only being used for tourism. You go to a backpacker hostel, you do the pub crawls, which are great. You do the city walks, which are great. You get introduced to all the cheap food places in the city, which are great. So great stuff, but it's all tourism, travel and tourism. And so the insight was, wow, you can actually do a lot more in these spaces than just what is currently offered. And I realized that these spaces are actually universities. They're like education spaces. You're learning so much about the cultures of the city, the histories of the city. So they're sort of like micro campuses in a way. They're just not positioned as campuses. And there's all these ideas that are flowing through these spaces. I just remember sitting there and talking about finance with like folks from all around the world, and I learned about how does the central banks work in your country, and so great spaces for ideas. So I just realized that, wow, these are like literally small innovation hubs. That's what they are. They're just not being positioned as such. And so in the back of my mind, these ideas and insights were there, but I never thought about turning that into a business idea until much later. So the genesis of the idea was being built up as I was traveling.
And what was sort of the inflection point for that? At what point did it come from, or go from, an idea that was percolating in the back of your head to like, hey, we're doing this?
Towards the end of my trip, the last 6 months of my trip, I wanted to sort of I didn't want to travel, like hop around as much, because I was hopping around a new country every week. I was going to a new country or going to a new city every few days. And I started getting tired of just hopping a lot. So I spent some time staying. I got a place in Bangkok, and I love the city. It's just like one of the most exciting cities in the world for me. So I got a place there, and I was doing Southeast Asia, but in Bangkok, I actually started like a small startup incubator, and we got some friends together, and we're building 6 or 7 companies. So we were building a marketplace for plastic surgery. We're building an accounting software. We're building a food delivery app. Like, we're building all these ideas in this like small hacker house that we had put together. And I was traveling to Singapore to raise money for these ideas during those last 6 months. And I got introduced to the venture capital world in Singapore because I was coming here basically every few weeks to raise money. So I was getting introduced to VCs, and I was showing them all these different ideas we're working on. And during that time, I met a girl in Bangkok, and she was living in Singapore. So we fell in love. We're married now. We just had our second child. And
Congratulations.
thank you, thank you. Yeah, so she was like, hey, either I move to Bangkok or you move to Singapore. We can't do this long distance thing. So I ended up moving to Singapore. And at that point, I needed a job. Like, I was 2 years of traveling. So I actually got a really awesome job. One of the VCs that I had been talking to while I was raising capital, they were looking for someone like me who had banking experience, who had experience fundraising, and experience like building things and tinkering with things. So they offered me a job to run a fund in Singapore. And so I was running around all of Asia, trying to find early stage companies to invest in. So I did about 10 investments in Malaysia, Japan, India, Philippines, like Southeast Asia
Mm-hmm.
mostly. And the fund I was working with was a very interesting fund. It was it was started by this Japanese entrepreneur who had taken a company public and taken the proceeds to start this new company and this new fund. He told me, Vikram, I'm looking for entrepreneurs. I'm not looking for bankers. So if I want you to start a company in a year. And so I was like, sure, that's perfect. That's exactly what I'm looking for.
Music to my ears.
Yeah. So as this 1 year of me investing in companies, I was thinking of business ideas like, hey, what's the next thing I want to work on? And as I was traveling, I was very much looking for young, very early stage ideas. And I noticed that all of these startups that I was talking to were on a very tight budget. And when they would travel to different places, they're staying like very small budget,
Mm.
hotels or backpacker hostels. And it just wasn't the right conducive spaces for them. They were staying there because it was super cheap. And so then I was like, what if we had spaces that were inexpensive, but had like this whole entrepreneurial ecosystem in the space? Then wouldn't that be more conducive for these folks? So those sort of ideas started percolating, and then I started putting the two and two together with my travels. And so then I pitched the idea to Shuhei, who's the founder of the fund. And I said, hey, what if we build a chain of like backpacker hostels that are really a combination of universities, investment houses, and has a whole entrepreneurial ecosystem. And he was like, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Here, he wrote me a first check. He gave me a check and said, okay, you've got 3 months to build me a prototype. So I had a deadline and I had a check. And so I used to walk past this backpacker hostel to go to work every day. And I was just like, how am I going to build a prototype with a small check, in a couple of months? So I walked into the backpacker hostel, spoke to the owner, and I asked him if he wanted to sell the business. And he was like, yeah, I'm actually trying to sell the business. So literally the next day I bought the business and we repurposed it into a startup house, rebranded it into Tribe Theory, and just magic started happening. People from all around the world would come there. And because Singapore is such it's a hub for raising capital. It's a money
Mm.
center. So we all of a sudden overnight, we would just have like all these startups from all around the world hanging out there, raising money, looking for founders, looking for co-founders, looking for developers. And it just became like this hive that we knew that, there's something here. And so we took that concept regionally. We opened up a few more spaces. And yeah, I mean, magic was happening. All the things we were imagining started happening just by the fact that these were startup houses. And so in Bali, all of these digital nomads who were actually trying to build things would come and stay with us because they would find the right networks while they were there. And so it's just a lot of magic started happening, and we knew we were on to something at that point. Yeah.
So before we kind of go any further, because I definitely want to dive in a little bit deeper on that, but just so that people don't get confused with names and that kind of stuff. You guys did rebrand from Tribe Theory to now you are called the Draper Startup House. Can you kind of quickly go over why that change happened and kind of the story around that, just so that we don't have to constantly be saying Tribe Theory, which is now the Draper Startup House, and people are like, what is going on here? So can you just
Right.
kind of quickly go over why the change happened?
Sure. So the Tribe Theory was the first brand, and the reason why we named it Tribe Theory at the time was the first space we launched, which was just a prototype. It was the headquarters for the first Chinese clan in Singapore. So the history goes that in 1840, Raffles, who was the British military commander, he came to Singapore to colonize the country or the island. And there was a 16-year-old carpenter from the Guangdong province in China who ended up on the ship with him and became his carpenter. And so when the ship landed on the island, this 16-year-old kid, he did some scouting for Raffles to make sure that there was no danger, and he helped plant the British flag on the island. And so this 16-year-old kid, he got Raffles was so happy with him, he gave him a piece of land. And he used that to build businesses. He did timber and spices, and became a very, very wealthy entrepreneur. So he wanted to give back. So he started the first Chinese clan or association in Singapore. And this was a place where immigrants like him from his province in China would come. When they land in Singapore, they would come to this house to make friends, to get business networks, to find connections. So that house where we first started our prototype, that was the place. And so we thought it was so appropriate to call it Tribe Theory, because everyone has ideas about what a tribe is, but this space literally was what we wanted to do. So as we expanded, and we were then, a year later, we were in 5 countries. And one day we got approached by Tim Draper's some of the people that work with him. They had heard about us, and they loved what we were doing. And I don't know if you know who Tim Draper is, but he's a little bit of a well-known investor in Silicon Valley who has a bit of a very global ecosystem that he's created for startups.
And he's a big proponent of like Bitcoin now as well, right? And cryptocurrencies, and kind of the this whole new world of global finance.
Correct. Yeah, he's a big believer in Bitcoin and a big proponent of Bitcoin. Also, he's had some really good wins. He was one of the first investors in Hotmail, which sort of revolutionized email. And I think he has 30 or 40 unicorns under his belt. Tesla, SpaceX, I don't know. The name goes on and on. So
a lot of name brand companies that now people would recognize. I think Robinhood as well, and like some of these other ones.
Yeah, Coinbase. So he has a lot of good wins in terms of like tech companies. And he's built the Draper Venture Network, which is a network of 24 venture capital funds around the world. So anywhere from Argentina to Mexico to Poland to Japan to Australia, there's all these venture capital funds that are part of the Draper Venture Network. And so he was one of the first people to globalize venture capital, because venture capital kind of started in the Bay Area originally. And it was a very much like U.S. centric kind of thing. But he was one of the first folks, or at least his dad, to really take it global and internationalize and globalize the venture capital industry. And so he heard about what we were doing, and he loved the idea. So I went out to meet him in San Mateo, and he basically said, "Look, this thing has potential. why don't you join our brand and our ecosystem? He invested capital into the company. And for me, it was a no-brainer because I wanted to build an entrepreneurial ecosystem. Like I wanted to build, I wanted to have a fund and I wanted to have a, education, do all of these things. So joining his ecosystem was a no-brainer because we now didn't have to go out and build an ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
We could just essentially build distribution points. And so earlier this year, we rebranded to Draper Startup House, and now we're part of the Draper startup ecosystem. So we have access to the venture funds. We have access to Draper University, which is the education arm, and so now we can very quickly do all the things we wanted to do. So now it's called Draper Startup House.
So kind of coming back to what the Draper Startup House is, you kind of talked about the fact that this was a natural place for people who are entrepreneurs and who are traveling, or at least entrepreneurial. They kind of come together and be in a community together. But in what other ways is the experience different if somebody comes to the Draper Startup House as opposed to going to another, hostel or just getting an Airbnb or whatever else a digital nomad might do? What is, like, if I were to walk into a location somewhere in the world, what would my experience be like as I walk through the door?
Sure. So just for clarity, what we are doing is still experimental. We're 2.5 years old as a company, and this idea is still experimental. I mean, we know that it works mostly, but it's not perfect. And because of COVID this year, we just haven't had the full chance to really like experiment fully and iron out the kinks and really build a solid business model. So it's still experimental in my mind. We have a very long ways to go, but at the heart of it, what we're trying to do is two things. One, we want to create a new category in hospitality. So if you think about just hospitality in general, like you look at the Hiltons or you look at the Holiday Inns or any sort of hotel chains, there's not been a lot of innovation in the traditional hospitality model. There's always new hospitality brands that pop up. But if you look under the hood, it's a shade of new color schemes, it's a shade of new music and maybe a new type of restaurant, new foods. Maybe they're targeting a different crowd. But generally, there has been no sort of fundamentally new innovation in the hospitality space. I guess the last major innovation is probably Airbnb. But at the end of the day, Airbnb is sort of a marketplace. And I'm talking about like a real unique innovation. And so the idea is, how do you take a space like a hotel space and do a lot more with it than just accommodation and entertainment? Mm-hmm. And so we're saying, hey, these spaces can be university campuses, these spaces can be traditional hospitality, and these spaces can be investment houses where all of the ideas floating around, what if we could find a way to invest in those ideas. So we're trying to create a new category in hospitality, which requires a lot more work than we have put in, but really creating a new hospitality concept. So that's one. Secondly, we want to create a new sort of tourism model called entrepreneurial tourism. And this sort of came about when I was traveling. I would do all the city walks and all the pub crawls and all the tasting of the foods. But people are now interested in what's happening in sort of the startup world and what's happening in the business world when I go to a new city. Mm-hmm. And so it was missing when I was traveling. So if I went to Berlin as a backpacker, I would get very much introduced to the Berlin tourism space, but I have no way to really get into the local entrepreneurial community. Now, where are the startups? Where are the investment houses? And so these spaces can be landing pads where people can come and really get plugged into the local entrepreneurial community. And every city has an entrepreneurial community, has a business community. And so creating this entrepreneurial tourism as a category and this new hospitality category. And the goal with this is all the floating ideas and seekers, as we call them, we can help them build businesses. And so now our mission has become a lot more than hospitality. Our mission now is by 2030, so we've got 10 years, we want to help build 1 million businesses around the world through our physical infrastructure. And so now our concept has become larger than life, because we're saying to governments and we're saying to cities that, hey, we can actually help with economic development in your city or in your country, because all of these people are coming through these countries anyways. We're just building the ability for them to actually build businesses in your country. And I'll give you an example. When I was backpacking, I went to Myanmar for the first time in 2015 or 2014. It's 5-6 years ago, when the country was barely just opening up. It had been under, military rule for a long time and was just starting to open up. And that's when, a SIM card that you put on your phone costed $2,000. Now it's like $2. And I was staying in this backpacker hostel, and it was full of Israelis. And I thought that was fantastic, because these are all Israelis who had just graduated from the military, because in Israel, I think there's a mandatory military service. And then when they're done, they get like 6 months to go travel. And Israelis, for some reason, are super adventurous. And so they go to Mongolia, they go motorbiking in Mongolia. They do all this crazy adventure stuff. So there was like this natural attraction, I think, at the time to go to Myanmar, which is sort of like this new adventurous, new frontier. And all of these Israelis, like, super well educated, they're like cybersecurity experts. They're coming out of the military, super well trained in a lot of things. And they're sitting in Yangon, and all they're doing is like visiting the pagodas, going to the street food markets, which is all great. But like, God, they have so much more to contribute to the country than just spending dollars on, the food stalls and the pagodas. They have this intellectual skill set that they could share with the locals. And so now we have a startup house in Yangon. And when all of these tourists and backpackers come, we tell them, hey, here's all of these startup events happening in Yangon. Here's all of these companies that need help with X, Y, and Z. And we're seeing that our tourists or our backpackers who are staying there, they're actually saying, I want the real local experience. I want to go and talk to these entrepreneurs, local entrepreneurs, and I want to see if I can help them build a company. And so this mind share that's happening is actually really, really good for the country, because they're now able to extract from these tourists more than just their tourism dollars, but their intellectual ability and skill set. So I think this, if we're able to execute on this, we'll be able to really like genuinely create value that's unlocking something that's sort of trapped right now. So that's the goal.
I love this concept of entrepreneurial tourism, because that's essentially what I do, and that's the reason why I travel. Like, I love to go to new places and find out what's going on here. What are the people that are here? Like, what kind of businesses are going on in here? Like, I love that. That is like, you were saying that you were kind of getting sick of traveling at one point, and I'm definitely like, I can't go to another, like cute like shop or like whatever. I love to go and find a co-working spaces and go work there for a few weeks and meet the people and go to events and those sort of things. So I totally understand this sort of creating a hub for that, where if I'm coming over to Singapore and I want to find out what's going on in there, and then like kind of get clicked into the local economy, the local sphere, a place that is central would be really great. I usually use co-working spaces for that, but I can totally see the difference between like, hey, come live here, like meet the people that are here. And the other thing that I love about this is there's obviously this big problem in the digital nomad space of a lot of digital nomads feel like they're takers, right? Like we go to new locations and we sort of get a lot of benefit out of that location, but we don't necessarily give back. And that's been a big problem, I think, is that, we go and we live in these places, we eat cheap food and stay in cheap places, but we don't really give back to that economy in any way. And I like this idea of, hey, come here and actually join into the ecosystem and give back to it. So I really love that, and I think that that's such a cool way to do tourism. But I want to ask you some. I'm really one thing that's kind of a question mark for me in this entire um, business model, so to say, is how do you actually filter the people that come to stay at the Draper Startup House, right? Because a lot of if we were to look at other co-living spaces or other hostels, they use a lot of these third-party apps, right? Where I'd come in, look at booking.com, find a hostel and go there. But how do you like filter so that there aren't backpackers that are coming, but there are people who are coming who are interested in entrepreneurship?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question, and I think it's a central question because if you get that right, then a lot of other things fall in place. And to get what you're saying right, like getting the right people into the space, is probably the hardest thing to do. And we're still trying to figure it out, to be honest. But here's some statistics that I can share with you over the last 2.5 years that we have seen in our spaces. So our spaces are completely open to anyone that wants to come and stay. So there's no requirements. You don't have to check a box that I'm this type of a person. We're on Booking.com and Agoda and Expedia and Hostel World and Air. We're available to anyone who wants to come and stay. But what we have noticed is people self-select themselves into our space because of the way we have positioned ourselves. Let's just take Booking.com an example. If you go to Booking.com, you type in Draper Startup House, it'll say Draper Startup House for entrepreneurs. The photos are like a very specific type of photo. So if you're a family of 3 kids who you're not going to come and stay in a place where clearly it's not meant for you. So just because of the way we have positioned ourselves on these third-party sites, there's a lot of self-selection that happens. So that's a good thing. Now, in the beginning, we were like, oh, we have to be very careful on who we let in. We have to be very, tight controls because we want to be a place where only these types of people come in. And actually, that approach turned out to be wrong for us because by being an open place, there were so many people that came that we would have never had in our space if it wasn't they stumbled into our space. They found us on Agoda and they just literally just were like, oh, this place is like cool. So they come. Now, because we didn't have any of these tight controls, actually it turned out to be much better for us because we then got customers and guests who we would have never had if we had these tight controls. So that's thirdly, we say that innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so if it's a house full of people staring at the computers and just building stuff all the time, it's just not fun. We actually want a place where it's a combination of, work, get stuff done, but also fun. So we want the photographers and the creatives and the dancers and the artists to be there. I think the combination of like very interesting people, that combination makes the experience a lot better. But the observation for us has been that generally around 60 to 70% of the people that come and stay with us are sort of like the target audience we're trying to get anyways. And the other 30 and 35% of the folks that I wouldn't say are our target audience, but they just add a lot more flavor to the mix. And so I think it's a positive thing. I mean, this year, even despite COVID, And this year was terrible for our business. I mean, absolutely terrible for our business. But in all our spaces, we served 3,000 guests from 92 different countries in all our spaces globally. And out of those 3,000 guests, about 60% were our target audience. And that's a lot of people that we've been physically, average stays around 7 days. And in 7 days, God, you can really get to know someone and help them build their ideas. And so we're so long-winded answer, but to be concise, we're still trying to figure it out. But there's a self-selection process that's happening, which has been a very positive thing.
How do you, because the other sort of, you have the people, but then the other thing is the locations, right? And you guys have several locations. There's a lot in Southeast Asia. I know you guys have Estonia and Lisbon as well. And then you also have Austin. That's the only US location at the moment, correct?
Yeah. So Austin is our first US location. The plan is to have spaces in all the major cities. So our ambition
In the
is
US.
in the world is, and of course in the US as well. So Austin is the first location, but we want to have spaces all around the US, definitely.
So this is how do you choose a city right now? Because that's really interesting. I think that's like the other variable, right? Is you have the people as one variable, and then the other variable is like the locations. So right now, when you're thinking about what are the next like 10 locations that you're going to be setting up Draper Startup Houses in, what are the criteria? Do you have any ideas what those cities might be so that people can kind of like look forward to that?
Yeah. So there's two categories of spaces or cities or locations that we want to be in. One is major city centers that are startup hubs. So places like Berlin, places like London, places like Tokyo. These are all cities that we want to be in, urban city centers, startup hubs. So we want to be there. But then also, secondly, we want to be in places where they're emerging places. So you mentioned, Eastern Europe. We want to be in Warsaw. We want to be in Prague. We want to be in, Kiev. We want to be in those sort of like emerging spaces. And then also we want to be in sort of like idyllic spaces where, like Bali is not a startup hub, but Bali is a place where a lot of talented people come through that we can be in touch with in other parts of the world as they're traveling around. Chiang Mai is not a startup hub, but it is starting to become a startup hub. It's the second biggest city in Thailand, and there a lot of people are moving to Chiang Mai to build on work on their businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the sort of like criteria we'll look at, but ultimately the most significant criteria and the biggest thing that we look at is, can we get the right team to be there? So for instance, in Chiang Mai, the person that's building Draper Startup House in Chiang Mai, her name is Lily. She's from Chiang Mai. She lives in Chiang Mai. And she's exactly the right person to build this business. And she just happened to be in Chiang Mai. If she was in Bangkok, she would have built it in Bangkok. So finding the right people who are committed to that city. The reason we're in Estonia is because our co-founder Indrek, who is building Draper Startup House in Estonia, he's Estonian, and he just happened to, he loved, I met him in Singapore, and he was like, hey, I want to take this to Estonia. So he was the right person to do it, and he was committed to that city. So that's the first thing we look at. Who are the right people, and are they committed to that city? And then we look at, is this the right city or whatnot?
Yeah, I saw something on the website about that you guys have an ambassador program where it's like, hey, if you think a city is a good fit, like help us start a place there. What is like, if somebody's listening to this and they're like, oh, I know a place, I know a city where they should have a Draper Startup House, what would be the process for them to come? And then like, what do you offer as support to actually establish a Draper Startup House in that new city?
Yeah, so we have basically anyone that's come through our spaces and stayed with us and become a community member. We ask them, hey, do you want to become an ambassador? and a lot of times they do. So we have ambassadors all around the world. We have ambassadors in like Beirut, and these are Fuad and George from Lebanon who had stayed with us in Singapore, who came here to be part of an accelerator program, and they went back to Lebanon, and they're our ambassadors. And hopefully someday we could do something in Lebanon, or the people from Turkey who stayed with us. So we definitely want to have ambassadors. In terms of people who want to launch Draper Startup House in their respective city, we've sort of put that on hold right now just because of COVID. But we're also trying to figure out the way to scale our business. Because right now, as you know, scaling physical infrastructure and physical businesses is not easy. And also, you really have to figure out the business model. Because in theory, it's a great idea to think, okay, we have like these startup houses all around the world. But in practicality, making that work with the right consistency, with the right experience, and the right business model, where it's built on a very solid business foundation, is a very difficult thing to do. And one of the things that I told Tim when we first met, and he was asking about our business idea, was I really want to commercialize this concept. So the TV show Silicon Valley, where there's like the hacker homes where people are, and by the way, there are a lot of hacker homes around the world. There's a lot of hacker houses in the Bay Area, and there's hacker houses around the world, and these are a house where some friends, they open it up on Airbnb and turn them into hacker houses. It's great, but they're not commercially viable businesses, right? They're like, I want to commercialize this concept into a real hospitality business that's licensed, that can actually be a real business model. And so doing that is a lot more difficult, because you have to look at the right cities, you have to look at the right real estate ratio, you have to look at the right financing, you have to look at, so there's a lot of real commercial real estate that goes into this, because we actually don't want this to be very informal hacker houses around the world, because we want to commercialize it. So we're trying to figure that out. And we've learned from other companies who have done something similar. We look at WeWork, who scaled very fast, but then they didn't have the right sort of solid commercial business foundations from a unit economics perspective. And so these are all things we're learning from and saying, how can we build this as a commercial business with the right unit economics? And it's probably not going to be informal hacker houses around the world.
Yeah, I was just gonna say WeWork is maybe not the best business model to study on how to do this successfully, since they kind of went up, but then they kind of crashed down. But yeah, I think I totally agree with you. I understand what you're saying is like anyone can kind of do what you guys have done in a single entity, right? Like anybody can go and open up a co-living space and a co-working space together in a certain spot, but actually doing that at scale and figuring out the playbook that works in Austin and in Chiang Mai and in Berlin, that's kind of going to be the secret sauce. It's almost like I think about it as like a McDonald's that's like in a different cities. Essentially, you need to figure out like what is that model behind it that essentially allows you to really go anywhere.
Yeah, definitely. And I actually, for me, I love studying WeWork because I think they did a lot of things right. And of course, they did a lot of things that didn't work out. But you got to give WeWork credit for being the first mover, in the sense that they were the first ones to say, wow, we can scale a business really, really fast. And of course they threw a lot of money at it, but the money was given to them by someone to do this, right? And they were the first movers who actually kind of showed that you can actually scale real estate relatively fast. Because before WeWork, like I always say that there was before the internet, things were local, right? So you only knew your local communities, and the internet came around, and then things became global. But then now we're saying, hey, actually, is it possible to scale a real estate model better than it was done before. And I think WeWork was the first mover to try to do this. And I think there's a lot of things we can learn from there, but they did a lot of things right. I mean, in terms of building a great brand, that people love. I mean, when you go into WeWork, it's amazing to go work there.
Well, and I think they, credit where credit is due. I think that they made co-working a household term, right? I think co-working before then was a far more niche idea that maybe not a lot of people had heard of. And it really became something that everybody knows what it is because of WeWork. Whether they had a successful business model behind the business or not, they definitely succeeded at that. So 100%. I do want to ask, because you did mention this, that you guys have a slogan that is that it's your goal to create 1 million entrepreneurs by 2030. Now that is certainly a big goal, and I understand the idea of having a big goal that drives sort of everybody that comes to work for you. But how do you, why? So I'm trying to figure out how to ask this, because I see a huge value of more people being entrepreneurial, right? People, I don't think entrepreneurship as a skill is taught in school enough. I think a lot of kids are still being taught like, hey, go to college, get a job, and stay in the career. And I think that the writing was on the wall that that sort of lifestyle was going to be over. That sort of employment maybe wasn't going to be as popular or as certain or as safe as a path as it once was. COVID just took that and sped that up, by 100, because so many people just realized that, hey, we can hire freelancers from all over the world. We don't need to have people in the office. And all of a sudden, I think freelancing and these sort of entrepreneurial skills are going to be far more important. So can you just talk about why is this sort of the reason why it's important for you guys to create 1 million entrepreneurs? Like, give us a little bit more of background to that goal, because I do think it's a really interesting goal.
Yeah. So the general thesis, as you rightfully said, is the world will be a better place if more and more people become masters of their own destiny, and be able to, think in a more entrepreneurial way. And so when we look at what is it that we're really trying to do as a business, I think we're trying to contribute to society by enabling more and more people to become masters of their own destiny. Now, whether they're a solopreneur, running their one-person business, e-commerce business, to a real company that has employees and payroll and trying to build tools and services that are useful to society. The spectrum is very, very wide. It could be, we say 1 million entrepreneurs, and we don't mean 1 million tech entrepreneurs. We're helping our employees launch their own brownie business, and so the idea is to really help people become masters of their own destiny, whether it's a very small mom and pop business to a large scale business. And so just the general thesis is just that the more we try to do that, the more solutions there will be to a lot of the problems in the world. And it's for us the best platform to be able to achieve this. Now, the number of 1 million, I hope it's more than 1 million, because it's, there's 7 billion people in the world. And if our ambition is to have spaces all around the world, in all the major cities in the hub, reaching 1 million people is going to be very, very easy. It's not going to be difficult. But we chose 1 million because it's a starting point. And we've given ourselves 10 years to do it. And now that we're part of the Draper ecosystem, we have access to all of the different venture funds around the world. So there's a lot we can do from an education perspective, from a investments perspective. So I don't think 1 million is going to be a very hard number to reach, but it's good to have a milestone that's on the wall that you can all sort of work towards. So I think it's a bit more of a symbolic number than anything else, to be honest. But the thesis is, I think, very solid and strong, and it makes the hospitality concept more interesting, because then now it's not just about how many layers of sheets do you have on your bed, to like, who are the people staying there and how can we actually help them fulfill their dreams. And as a business, if that's your thesis and that's your goal, there's so many different revenue streams that you can actually build in that hospitality space, because no longer are you just accommodation. You could be, I mean, as an investment house, you could be have so many different streams to help people fundraise and finance their businesses. And so I think the combination of all of these things is something that's complex, but you need a little bit of complexity to make a business model, I think, exciting.
Mm, yeah. For me, like entrepreneurship is, and I think it's interesting because we kind of are talking about several different types of businesses, right? And you kind of mentioned in passing that you don't think of Chiang Mai as a startup city. But to me, it's certainly a startup city. Now, the startups, quote unquote, that are happening there are different than what you might see in Silicon Valley, right? Where in Silicon Valley, you're getting a lot of funded tech startups, while in Chiang Mai, there are tons of people going there to start businesses that are far more maybe services or e-commerce or productized services, or these sort of, it is a digital nomad hub, and a lot of digital nomads like those businesses. So for me, like I totally agree. And I think, I was just speaking with a friend today who was telling me that he helps train freelancers and helps them, build that into a sustainable business. And the thing he said is, we have had a huge explosion of people coming in, and it's mostly people who are skilled professionals who don't have a job anymore because of COVID, and they're trying to figure out how to take their skill and start their own business or their own freelancing through that. So I totally agree. I think that you don't need to have a startup that's funded in order to be an entrepreneur, in order to, like you said, control your destiny. I think that's what really the goal for a lot of entrepreneurs is.
Yeah, definitely. And the reason why I'm super excited about what we're working on is because we're so early on this massive wave of opportunity that's coming to the world. And of course, COVID has accelerated a lot of these things, but I really think that productivity is going to be, it's just the rules of measuring productivity have changed, whether it's large companies or individuals or a small company. There were certain rules to measure productivity and efficiency, and those rules are being rewritten and people are saying, hey, what does it mean to be productive? Where do you work from? How many hours do you put in? Like, what are the rules? And so because the rules of how we measure productivity and efficiency is changing, there's going to be a massive change in the world in terms of where people live, how they work, where they work, what do they work on, and the ability for people to just really do things with themselves. And so I think this massive opportunity set of the way people are working is going to change. It's going to create a lot of potential for people to build infrastructure for that new economy that's emerging. And when I say infrastructure, I don't mean just digital infrastructure, digital tools, but I also mean like physical infrastructure. And when people ask me what's my job, I tell them I'm a plumber, because, and I don't mean plumbing in the sense of like actually the water pipes and stuff, but like I'm building physical infrastructure around the world, which means like legal infrastructure, ownership infrastructure in different countries. And that's just the plumbing, right? That's the foundational plumbing of setting up a global business. And you've got to start with the plumbing first, right? The foundational stuff of building physical infrastructure. And I think that's the hardest part of building a physical business, is actually building the plumbing system. And so those opportunities to help with this new wave of the way people travel and work, I think it's going to create massive opportunities for tons of businesses to play a role in. And if you think about digital nomadism, as we're saying, like I kind of fell into it. It's not a very old concept. I mean, it started probably when the internet started, which was actually like much further. I think that Tim Ferriss wrote his book like what, 15
Oh,
years
wait.
ago.
Oh, 07. Yeah.
Right. So digital nomadism as a thing, it's not a very old industry. It's only 10, 15 years old, and that's nothing. And 10 years is nothing. I think this is uh, just starting. And 20 years from now, 10 years from now, it's going to look very different. I actually think it's going to look very different in the sense that we as people from the West, right, people who have uh, I would say privileged to have the ability to just pick up a bag and travel. Not everyone has that. I think digital nomadism is going to become a lot bigger in individual countries. So when I look at a country like India, and so we have a space in Bangalore, which is my favorite space. It's fantastic. People in India don't have the ability to just pick up a bag and get on a plane and travel, right? There's a lot of restrictions to have from financing to the visas and passports and whatnot. But God, digital nomadism within India is becoming really, really popular. So someone living in a 23-year-old, coder living in Mumbai, it's like, hey, I don't need to be in Mumbai, which is a terrible city. Why don't I go up to the mountains and go to Goa and work from
Mm.
there? So digital nomadism within countries is going to be, I think, a much larger opportunity set than actually people from Michigan flying to Chiang Mai. In China, within China, digital nomadism is going to be a huge opportunity set. Within Indonesia, of Indonesians saying, screw Jakarta, I'm going to Bali to go work on my company. I think these opportunity sets don't necessarily have to be global and international. They can actually be local and regional. And those are the trends that I'm actually super excited about, because within Thailand, we're seeing, Thai entrepreneurs from Bangkok saying, I'm going to the mountains because the city is too just way too congested, or I'm going down to and so it's going to unlock the potential for people without means and without the ability to go move to Estonia or Barbados, right? They're going to be within the countries are going to be, and that is something I'm excited about, because God, we can help millions of people within India become entrepreneurs.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the same thing will be true about the United States. Like, I think a lot of and I mean, I think you've already seen it for some people. Like, there's some famous examples of people who've already left the big cities. Like Joe Rogan moved to Austin from San Francisco. There's several other prominent, CEOs that have moved out of California. But I think that's only beginning, and maybe they're sort of like the edge of the sword, or the point of the arrow of the people that are leaving. And there's going to be a lot more people that are leaving New York, San Francisco, Chicago to these sort of secondary cities because, well, the cost of living is lower. I still have my great job that's in New York, but I don't need to be in New York anymore. So why should I pay the rent of New York when I can go be in a city? And I've always said Cincinnati, where I'm at right now, is a phenomenal city just waiting for remote workers, because great downtown, great restaurants, bars, whatnot, actually really good startup ecosystem. But like, hey, the rent's like, a third of that in New York. So I think you're going to see that in the US as well. And to kind of echo what you're saying, I think even though COVID has been a really terrible thing, the really interesting thing has been that it's really opened up this opportunity and this industry and ecosystem that we're familiar with to, I think, a lot more people. And so you're starting to see sort of these, you talk about physical infrastructure, but I also think there's a lot of non-physical infrastructure. I don't have a smart way of saying that is popping up to support these people. You have companies like Safety Wing that are trying to figure out health insurance. You have other companies, like, for example, Nomad X and Flatio, that I've had the founders of on this podcast, that are trying to figure out this midterm rental market all over the world. And so there's all of these things popping up now that weren't around 10 years ago. You have Skylink, from SpaceX, that's going to be doing global Wi-Fi, so you're not going to be worried about internet speeds anymore. So with that in mind, this has been a topic that we've been talking a lot about. We've been talking about a lot on this podcast, is this sort of like, what are the next 10 years going to look like? Because all of the things we thought we were going to see in the next 5-10 years have now just blown up, and there's a lot more things. So from your point of view, what are some of those opportunities? Like, what are some of the areas that you think are wide open as an opportunity for people to create and build new things for digital nomads?
Oh yeah, I mean, great question. And I don't have a magic ball, so I don't really know. But here's some
Just in your opinion, if you were to roll the dice, so to say,
yeah. The first thing that comes to my mind, because I've seen it firsthand this year, and now that we're part of the Draper startup ecosystem, and helping people raise capital is a big part of what we do. So we've got the physical infrastructure, hospitality piece going on, but we have three verticals. We've got the physical infrastructure, hospitality. We've got the education business, and we have the business where we help people raise money. What I have seen on both the education and the capital raising part is the movement of capital has just become more global than it was pre-COVID. And the reason for that is you have investors now doing deals from their laptop. They're not traveling anywhere. So they're doing more deals because they have more time. And they're saying, hey, if I'm doing deals and investing in people without meeting them, why am I only restricted investing in my city or my country? So we're seeing investments happening cross border a lot more than they were happening before. And so the movement of capital is becoming, the velocity is higher, and and the spread of capital is going much more global. So that's a great opportunity for let's say us. We're helping people. We're helping people from Myanmar raise money from Silicon Valley. We just sent a bunch of deals to Tim to say, hey, here's the top deals in Myanmar. I hope he invests in one of these. And if he does, it's going to be phenomenal, because that deal structure would never have happened a few years ago, right? Like, it's the idea of a investor from Silicon Valley investing in a country in Myanmar is just a few years ago it would have been so wild, but now it's just like commonplace. And so amazing opportunities in that space of investments, global investments. On the education piece, I think it's still very early stage, where a lot more people need access to education digitally, and because we have spaces around the world, we're seeing that there are not as many digital education platforms, let's say in Indonesia or in Russia, as compared to what's available in, say, the US. And so the distribution of education digitally to more and more people is a huge opportunity set in local languages, if I can say that. So for instance, people think of education in India, digital education, but India has 50 languages. And all the digital education that's being done is in English, or in the one or two. So local language education for countries in Africa, etc. That's a huge opportunity set. And then I also think a lot of like micro communities, because we as people in the digital nomad sphere talk about community a lot, but I'm seeing a trend of like micro communities. So for instance, we recently just launched here in Singapore a mompreneurs group to help mothers who are trying out various different entrepreneurial endeavors. That's a huge opportunity set. Or like artpreneurs, or like these micro communities, or like foodpreneurs. And I think these very specific niches, if that's the right word, of like these micro communities is going to be a huge opportunity as well. So these are all the things that I'm sort of just observing from the view of our business.
Awesome. Well, Vikram, I gotta say, thank you so much for coming on. I've had a ton of fun talking with you, and I'm really excited about what you guys are doing. And if anybody's who's listening is interested in visiting a Draper Startup House once COVID is over, or they want to connect with you. I know that you guys also have a free network that people can join. It's like a Slack group I'm a part of that they can go and like meet other people. Where can they find out more about all of that?
Yeah, the best place is just draperstartuphouse.com, our website. And on there you can, if you're raising capital, we have a tab that's ventures. You can learn more about that there. If you're looking for education, we've got an education tab. If you want to join our den, the Draper Entrepreneur Network, we have a Slack channel. It's right on the website. We're on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram. We're not on TikTok yet, but we should get on to TikTok. But yeah, we're on Twitter. We're in all the social media platforms, but our website's probably the best place to be, or our LinkedIn.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for coming by. I really appreciate it.